Chaucer has been called the father of English literature. Obviously, you've touched upon this. If you could just like summarize the points of why he was called that, and is it interesting that it was a poet as opposed to one who did not wrote but not poetry that is considered to be the father of English literature?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I think the way that we today think about poetry is quite different to the way that someone in the 14th or 15th century thought about poetry and poets. Because I think today, when we think about poetry, we mainly think about lyric poetry rather than narrative poetry. So we think more about short poems, about poems that might be more about an image or a mood, rather than about long narrative poetry. And that is largely, I think, because we have the novel for long narratives. Whereas in classical times and in medieval times, long narratives, long stories, ripping yarns, these were told in poetry. So in classical times, by people like Homer and then Virgil, and then in medieval times, you have people such as Dante and Chaucer, and they write their good stories in poetry, not in prose. So epics, great romances, these tend to be written in verse form. So I think it's quite what we would expect, that the great early English writers would be poets. I think that's not surprising. In terms of how he gets to be thought of as the father of English literature. So I think that partly this is about the fact that he is simply extremely good. He is an extremely good writer, and he writes a huge amount of English literature in all kinds of different genres. But he also gets kind of taken up in the 15th century in a very specific way. So this is very much a posthumous idea of Chaucer, where other poets in the 15th century start to talk about him as someone that is their influence, their source, and they start to talk about him as a father figure, as someone that they want to imitate.